Wednesday night after supper, we had a great presentation from Beth Remis at Georgia Interfaith Power and Light as she talked to us about creation care and how that's a centered part of our being based on our tradition. And she did a great job walking through Scripture and the church's tradition to make that case. If you were here a couple Sundays ago on the sermon I preached on the weekend, we were blessing animals and talking about St. Francis. Some of it may have sounded a little familiar. It's always nice to find out that somebody else interprets things the same way that you do. So she had the same bit of teaching about that Genesis concept of dominion having less to do with dominance of humans over the creation than it did care and responsibility for the creation. If you're with us last week in person or online, you heard a sermon about the pioneer spirit of the Christian faith and the question about what needs to make the journey and how much is enough as we wrestled with that very difficult passage where Jesus suggests it might be difficult for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. And if you're aware of your announcements, and I know many of you are because you registered for it, and I think some folks are coming at the next service because we have a barbecue today, our annual Pig Pickin, to launch our 2025 annual fund. It occurs to me that stewardship themes have been on my mind a lot in recent weeks, which is a way of warning you that this morning you get a whole sermon on stewardship. Everybody's favorite topic, right? We've locked the doors so you can't get out while we talk about it. But I realize it's been a while since I've actually preached an entire sermon just on the theme of stewardship. We touch on themes of stewardship in other sermons at other times through the gospel, but we're going to hit it head on today. So I hope you had your coffee this morning. Stewardship is obviously a broad topic. And so it has some very specific Christian context, but it's most simple whenever we talk about stewardship in any context. It means the responsibility we have for something that has been entrusted to us. And we can apply it to lots of things. There's lots of things that we are invited to be stewards of, starting with our own selves and our own families. We have family traditions, for example, that we steward from one generation to another as we tell stories and teach people what it means to have their name if it's a family name. Sometimes we hear people talk about the stewardship of our own bodies, that we only get them for a certain number of years and we need to take care of them to help them last as long as they can. We might hear stewardship of an organization that we belong to and its mission. In the same way that we talk about stewardship of the church and its mission and making sure that what we do here and now in the church allows another generation of believers to come after us. And of course, the stewardship that we hear a lot about is what we do with the gifts that we have and the talents and the industriousness that we have and the accumulation of our wealth over time. What is it that we do with that? That's part of what we talk about frequently with stewardship. And I think the concept comes up more frequently than not for us in the church as opposed to other settings because it is a central part of who and what we are to be stewards. We've talked about that a little bit recently. But we're going to talk about some of the whole aspects of this big picture stewardship and try to get a sense of how it just becomes a part of our life at every level. So if we're practicing a life of stewardship, that means that we have become a steward, somebody who serves another person in some way. Stewards are inherently other-focused because it is their job to be in that role in some way. It's a reminder of the teaching that Jesus has all the time in various ways to be focused on the other and the interconnectedness we have between ourselves and our lives and the world around us, full of so many other people going about their day-to-day business. Some of you may remember a story from last summer. There was a track meet in Europe, and one of the heats for the 100-meter relay, or 100-meter hurdles, looked a little bit different than a normal relay race. Because if you go back and you look at the video, you'll clearly see 7 women who look like they run the 100-meter hurdles, and one who looks a little different, who looks more like a shot put thrower. And that's because she was a shot put thrower. Her name is Jolien Blomko. I do not know how to pronounce it. It's a Belgian name. I could barely spell it. But she did, in fact, run the 100-meter relay that day. And when the gun goes off, 7 of the runners sprint away, as you would expect at a race like that, almost at Olympic speed. And Jolien comes running down at her pace and steps over the hurdle, runs to the next one, steps over the hurdle. She finishes something like 30 seconds behind the 7th place runner in that heat. I think it's a 12-second race normally. It's not a long race. And she was grinning. I mean, she knew what was going on. And so I was like, what in the world is going on? And there is a little bit of a backstory, and that is that the team from Belgium had realized injuries to all of their hurdlers. And they needed somebody to run that race so the whole team would not be disqualified from the meet. They had to have an entry in that race. And she was the one who was selected to do a race that is definitely not in her wheelhouse, and to go through what had to be somewhat embarrassing, knowing that she was just going to get annihilated by these folks who practiced this race all year for meets like this. But she did it with graciousness, and she did it because she no doubt understood the interconnectedness of her success in the shot put, which she had placed 7th in, by the way, with that of her whole team. That it was something to do to make sure that the team could thrive and do well, which in turn allows her to thrive and do well. And she understood that and lived that out very well, remembering some shared responsibility for others and not just focusing on what she was there to do. We also talk about stewardship in ways that we assume it is a reality. It's expected of us to be stewards. And that's because of things like we heard a couple weeks ago in the book of Genesis in the lectionary, when we hear of the special relationship God has for us in the midst of creation. If you go back and read the epistle from today, which we didn't hear in the liturgy, we're continuing through the book of Hebrews, and this is the passage where we hear about the high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And as the writer explains the role of the high priest, at the very beginning, there's just an assumptive description that says, and some of the spiritual matters of the people are handed to the priest to care for on their behalf. That some of the things in the common life of the people in the temple were entrusted to the priest, not for the priest's glory and thriving on his own, but because that's how he is tasked to care for the sheep in his flock. And we can hear again, although we may not be priests in the high order of Melchizedek in our minds, that we still have things that somebody entrusts us with somewhere for the glory of something greater than ourselves, and particularly in the realm of the church. That role of steward is incredibly important. If you go back and read Jesus' parables, you can be reminded of that. Stewardship also involves being attentive to people that we don't even know oftentimes. We'll never know in some cases. People who we may not even walk on the earth at the same time as they do, because they'll show up in a later generation. Because when we talk about stewardship, it is not just about what happens today, it's about what happens today and its impact on so much more, so much wider than we can imagine, and over time that we can scarcely imagine, where we might do something that has a generational impact that we will never live to see. How many of you are familiar with the watch brand Patek Philippe? Is that a name some of you know? Glorious watches that they make. They're beautiful. They're high-end watches. I don't think there's one on my Christmas list for a reason. But they're absolutely stunning, high-quality timepieces. And they've had this slogan that they've used on and off for quite a while that says, in essence, you don't really own a Patek Philippe. You just take care of it for the next generation, the one you're going to pass it on to. And you get the sense that, yes, it's a beautiful watch, and there's the bling factor if you have one, but there's more to it, because it's not just meant to be shiny and pretty, it's quality. It's meant to last. It's meant to be something that gets passed on to others. It's going to outlive us by quite a bit. It's going to keep ticking long after we stop ticking. And they want people to be aware of that, and it does add something when you think about it in that context. And of course, we know on another level, it's not just nice watches that applies to either. There are so many things we could pick out in our lives and say, it's not that we really own this, it's what we do with it until we pass it on to the next person. And you could go down the whole list, but we don't often do it. We don't often think about how much of what we do, much of what we have, how much of our ability in this lifetime is really just something that we're holding on to until it's time to give it to someone else. Now, stewardship isn't necessarily easy if it is, no doubt, part of who we are invented to be. Stewardship is difficult. It's not the most easy thing for us to figure out and live into on a day-to-day basis, because it's just against human nature sometimes to get it on the first try or the 100th try, as the case may be. The gospel today has our disciples in another experience of struggling to understand their identity. And in some ways, this is a question of stewardship as well, as Jesus has called them to be followers, has entrusted them with a certain set of tasks to help them spread the good news. They're clearly struggling with that identity and the stewardship of that identity. And so we hear them worrying about who's going to be on the left and right hand of Jesus' throne at some point in the future and in glory. And that translates into a very warped sense of their importance on this side of heaven too, doesn't it? Because when some of them find out that others are thinking about it, they start to argue about who's the greatest. And Jesus has to say, stop it, knock it off. This is not who we are. It's not about the greatest in that sense. If you're going to be in this following of mine, you have to remember that the greatest is the one who's the best servant, the chief servant of all. That's the orientation that we're looking for. And that's not always easy to do. It makes it a little difficult on us sometimes when we lose track of that thread. But again, remembering all the ways in which we have things that have to be oriented correctly is a lot to keep track of. Which is why talking about stewardship is sometimes difficult. It is not the most favorite thing in the world. That's why I joked about closing the doors. I mean, sometimes the people know you're going to talk about it. It's like, wow, look at that. I was up late with the Georgia game. I don't think I'm going to make it to church today. You know, it was a good excuse to miss the stewardship sermon. But I also think it's because thinking about it and how it works in my mind and my heart is that when we talk about stewardship, there's always a realization I learned something about what I could be doing that I'm not doing. That there's more that I could do, that I have something to offer that maybe I didn't realize I had to offer. And right behind that, unfortunately, is always this sense of disappointing God. And nobody likes to feel like they're disappointing God. And so sometimes when we think we're going to have that impact, we just ignore it altogether. And we get so caught up in a negative view of how it makes us feel that we lose the ability to hang in there and get to the positive, life-giving part of the message that comes with it as well. Because sometimes we're just far too hard on ourselves and don't give ourselves enough credit. That's also part of the human condition. Many of you here may remember our friend Paul Plager, faithful at the 8 o'clock service, who we sent on to glory within the last year or so. I remember Paul telling me once that he wasn't a very good golfer, which is funny because Paul's an incredible golfer. But as I was talking through, he was also saying, well, my brother's a good golfer. His brother won the U.S. Amateur, and he was very proud of his brother. And if you want to have that as what you're comparing yourself to do, then, yeah, most of the rest of us aren't good golfers, if that's our all or nothing goal. Paul was also a very humble guy about many things. But I thought, you're not giving yourself enough credit for being a good golfer. And I think oftentimes a lot of us don't give ourselves enough credit for being good disciples in the big scheme of things, doing the best we can on a day-to-day basis. Certainly not perfect. We are not perfect stewards by any stretch, any of us. But there is here a way to hear that we are already stewards. We're not starting from zero, and maybe we can do more, but this is not about making God upset or feeling guilty. It's about saying, help me open up to see what else is there that is a calling and an offer for me as an individual. Because as we know by now, every one of us has gifts and talents and resources and perspectives and wisdom that can benefit others around us in this generation and perhaps for generations to come. And part of the call of a Christian life is to make the best that we can with all those things we're given for the amount of time that we're given them on this side of heaven. And for us as Christians, one of the principal manifestations of how that plays out is in the way in which we support what God is doing in the church, the ways in which we participate in what God is doing in the church. The church didn't exist in Jesus' mind, perhaps, as it does today, but Jesus also founded the church by telling us what we were supposed to do in community and how we were supposed to take the gospel out into the world and make disciples and not leave any stone unturned to share the good news of God's love with people. And a part of that is what that then lightens up inside us to go out into the world and do. But But every once in a while, when we think about our stewardship and where we're going to invest ourselves, we get caught up only in certain things being worthy of our time and attention and our resources. You know, the places where the real Christian living takes place, maybe in the soup kitchen or in the shelter. And so there are people sometimes who forget that this work of the church, also imperfect, by the way, is also doing the work of Jesus in other ways to fulfill that great commission. For example, I think it's the work of Jesus when we gather together and share a sacramental life where we meet Jesus in bread and wine and the Holy Spirit is present in vows that we witness or the water that we touch, whatever it may be. I think that the work of Jesus is taking place any place and in any community where you're making opportunities for people to deepen their faith and mature in their understanding of what it means to follow Christ. If it's a place where you can get behind somebody and wind them up and send them out into the world to go out and do all the things that Christians are invited to do. I think it's the work of Jesus when we hear beautiful music and prayers and liturgy in church that inspire us and help us meet God along the way, perhaps in ways that we couldn't otherwise on our own. I think it's the work of Jesus when we are having Sunday school classes and we're training the next generation what the foundation of the faith looks like. So as they grow and mature and one day we step back or move on, we know that they too will be good stewards of the faith and the church that was entrusted to them. I think the work of Jesus is when we do pastoral care with each other and we become the healing hands and feet of Christ in casseroles and phone calls and cards and all the things we do to build a body. Even the barbecue that we're going to have in a little bit, 2 hours maybe, 2.5, that's the work of Jesus too. As people come together and they build this relationship that is formed in a love that makes us different from others because we know the love of God, that helps us connect with each other and know that we have that community that thinks it matters if we're there or not and what happens in our life. Sometimes when we are called upon to be stewards and to give of ourselves in some way, we hold on for a second because we try to assess whether we can find the best way to do that. Sometimes as a masquerade for control, that we don't really want to let go and trust that God can handle it, that maybe God needs me to keep an eye on this thing just a little while longer to make sure it happens the way it's supposed to. On Monday, I was one of the volunteers from Christ Church who went to the Salvation Army to help distribute food. They had gotten an emergency supply of food for post-hurricane relief delivered to Brunswick, 1,000 boxes of it. And we were part of the distribution line there on the street by their thrift store. And it was a long line for the whole 2 hours that I was there. And I think we probably gave away 800 or so of the boxes before I had to go. And so there was a little assembly line where somebody from the Salvation Army would talk to folks and find out how many boxes they wanted and then tell us who were loading how many boxes were supposed to go in the car. So we got the word that this car that was driving up was supposed to get a box, and the person went on to start talking to the next car. So we put the box in the woman's car, and she said, "Oh, can I have another box for my neighbor?" And I could see the wheels spinning in some of the volunteers as they debated whether they were going to put another box in the car. And I think some of us know the wheels that were spinning, like when somebody on the street asks us for something. And we want to help, but we have to think about it for a second, even if it only takes a second. And we're like, okay, let me see your shoes. What are you wearing? What are the chances you look like somebody who's going to buy food or put this into your rent or buy diapers? Or are you the person who's going to go around the corner to the liquor store? And we have to decide, can I be generous or do I need to control this scenario a little bit to make sure what happens? So it didn't take long. It all happens in a second, but you can see the movement on people's faces as they realize that it really doesn't matter why this woman wants a second box of food. The food is here to make sure that hungry people are fed. We are here to distribute the food. There is no real in-depth process we were going through to figure out whether you get 4 boxes or 5 boxes. You basically just said it. So after a brief moment's hesitation, absolutely, another box of food went in the car. Because it's not about gatekeeping the food, and it's not about worrying if she's telling the truth about her neighbor. What's the worst thing that can happen? Somebody eats that food somewhere along the line and isn't hungry. And so sometimes when we're invited to give and our intention is to give, but our gut tells us, ooh, let me hold on a little bit to this to make sure it's exactly what I think it needs to be. There's also a moment of stewardship of trusting that God does what God needs with the things that come before God, at an altar, in a food box, whatever it may be. How many of you read your catechism regularly? I know I read mine every Tuesday morning for about an hour. No, I don't. I'm just kidding. I shouldn't tell lies. I don't read mine either. So collectively, we sometimes forget that there's really neat stuff in there about our faith. And if you pull it out and you look in the section that says, what is our responsibility to our neighbor? It's a very long response. I think it's the longest one in the catechism because the one before it is, what is our responsibility to God? And then what is our responsibility to neighbor? And the way the answers are broken up is almost a parallel to the Ten Commandments. It's a thinking through theologically an implication beyond don't just steal from one another, don't just kill, but how to make that a positive thing. At any rate, at one part of that response, what is my responsibility to my neighbor? Here's what the Catechism says, that we are to use our talents and possessions as one who must answer for them to God. That's a little heavy for the Catechism. It's a little heavy for Sunday morning, isn't it? But there's something there worth pausing on for one moment. We talk about stewardship and the invitation to lead a life of stewardship, not so that we can try to avoid disappointing God. Nothing in our faith is motivated by not trying to disappoint God. That is a backwards way of responding to God. A life of stewardship is about responding because it's who we are and who we are created to be. As followers of Jesus, the gospel reminds us all over the place, including in today's gospel passage, that we are to be servants of all. We know that we're told to love our neighbor, and elsewhere when it asks the question, and who is our neighbor? The answer is essentially everybody is our neighbor. And we know from the Gospels, not just the Catechism, that's where things come from, is often the Bible and the traditions. But Jesus also says one day we will stand before the throne. No matter who's seated on the left and on the right, we know who's seated in the middle. And we will give an account for what we have done with the things that were entrusted to us and the opportunities that we were given. And although, again, our tendency is sometimes to clench up, and that makes us nervous, it doesn't need to be a process of fear. It doesn't need to be a process that makes us think about God's condemnation. Because if we are open to what God is doing in the invitation to a life of stewardship, it instead becomes a reflection and a response to what God has been doing throughout our life, if we've only paid attention to it. Because above all else, when we talk about stewardship, it is a response to the goodness and the provision of God in our lives. And if we can cultivate an awareness of that, if we can be thankful for God's goodness in our lives every day, hopefully throughout the day, every day, then an invitation to a life of stewardship becomes automatic. Not something based out of fear or shame or worry that we're not doing enough, but instead something that flows from that deep well of gratitude that builds up over a lifetime of recognizing and celebrating that our God is a God of abundance and a God full of blessings for us, and that is what will always be true.